The moment you finally set a boundary, something unexpected happens, something that shakes the entire dynamic more than anything else you've ever said, ever done, or ever felt in this connection. What most people don't understand is that when you draw a line, when you say, "This is what I need, this is what I deserve," you're not just changing the relationship, you're confronting an entire lifetime of emotional defenses inside someone who never learned how to handle closeness without fear. And the avoidant feels this shift like an earthquake beneath their feet. They don't show it at first. On the surface, nothing seems to change. They look calm, controlled, almost indifferent. They act like it doesn't matter. Like your boundary is simply a momentary discomfort they can shrug off. They question everything. They question your motives, your intentions, your stability. They question whether you've changed, whether you're slipping away, whether they misjudged you. All of this happens internally, silently, while they keep a straight face on the outside. And deep down, they're hurting. Not because your boundary harms them, but because it forces them to confront a truth they always run from. The truth that real connection demands responsibility. It demands effort. It demands showing up in ways they were never taught to. So their system does what it always does when faced with pressure. It recoils. There's a sharp jolt of ego that hits them. A voice inside that shouts, "Why did you change the rules? Why aren't you behaving the way you used to? You didn't do anything wrong. You simply grew. Emotionally, mentally, spiritually." But to them, your growth feels like instability, like a threat, because growth means unpredictability, and unpredictability means danger. That's when the pull-away begins. It's almost instinctual. Their mind tells them to take space, to guard themselves, to create distance so they can regain emotional control. You'll see it in the way their messages become shorter, or slower, or emotionally empty. You'll feel it through the silence, through the pauses, through the sudden drop in closeness. What most people misread as rejection is actually overwhelm. They distance themselves not because they don't care, but because caring too much is unfamiliar territory. And unfamiliar territory feels unsafe. So they retreat, not because your boundary hurt them, but because it touched them. It stirred emotions they don't know how to navigate, emotions that make them feel exposed. Emotions that remind them that connection can influence them, affect them, shake them. And the moment someone has that kind of emotional influence, the avoidant feels like they are losing control. They fear closeness just as much as they crave it, and your boundary forces both desires to collide inside them. But here's what nobody tells you. Even while they're distant, disconnected, or withdrawn, their true feelings leak through the cracks. They may hide their emotions, but they cannot hide the impact you've made. You'll catch subtle changes in their behavior, tiny signals that something in them is unsettled. Maybe they seem unusually quiet, or oddly irritated or distracted. Maybe they check your social media more often, or linger on your messages without replying. Maybe they scroll through your chats late at night, trying to understand where they went wrong without admitting it to themselves, because your boundary created a shift they're trying desperately to process. Inside them, there's a voice that says, "What if I lose them?" But that voice fights against another one that says, "Don't get too close." This inner conflict becomes a storm. They don't show it externally, but inside, they're battling fear, pride, longing, confusion, and self-protection all at the same time. And it's exhausting for them. They may act cold, detached, or aloof, but it's not because they don't feel anything. It's because they feel too much, and they don't know what to do with it. Your boundary, your strength, your self-respect does something they didn't expect. It exposes their emotional patterns. It confronts their avoidance. It reveals their vulnerability. They realize that they can't behave the same way anymore, not if they want to keep you. And that realization terrifies them, but it also wakes something inside them up. Even if they don't say a word about it, even if they try to pretend they're unaffected, there's a moment when they sit alone, in silence, and admit to themselves that your boundary means you see your worth, and seeing your worth means you might walk away if they don't change. And that is the very moment the avoidant starts to feel something they rarely feel: accountability. Not the kind that comes from pressure, but the kind that comes from fear of losing someone meaningful. Your boundary wasn't rejection, it was clarity. It wasn't an attack, it was alignment. It wasn't a threat, it was self-love. But to someone who has lived their entire life believing that closeness equals danger, your self-love feels like a doorway they're not sure they're ready to walk through. Yet, even with all their defenses, all their silence, all their distance, one thing becomes clear: your boundary shook them because it showed them something they didn't expect. You aren't afraid of losing them, but they are suddenly terrified of losing you. What happens next is subtle but profound. After the initial pull away, after the internal chaos and the ego flare-up, the avoidant begins to notice a quiet change within themselves. Even though they haven't said anything, even though their actions might still seem cold or distant, a small awareness starts to creep in. They realize that your boundary wasn't meant to punish them, wasn't meant to control them, wasn't meant to push them away. It was meant to preserve you. And that realization is confusing because it contradicts everything they've believed about closeness, about attachment, about connection. They are forced to sit with a truth they have long avoided. Your self-respect does not threaten your bond, it enhances it. At first, they wrestle with this awareness. There's a flicker of admiration mixed with guilt. Admiration because they recognize the strength it takes to hold your ground, to assert your needs without compromising yourself. Guilt because deep down, they know they haven't done the same. They haven't always met you with the honesty, the openness, or the emotional courage that you deserve. But they cannot voice this realization yet. To do so would mean lowering their defenses, admitting vulnerability, and confronting emotions they have spent years suppressing. So instead they oscillate, pulling back, testing, retreating, observing, all while their mind silently processes the disruption you've created. They start to test you, but not maliciously. It's not intentional cruelty. It's the internal calibration of someone who is unfamiliar with being truly challenged. They watch how you react when they pause their affection, when they delay a reply, when they act indifferent. Your reactions reveal boundaries they cannot ignore, and each measured, confident response forces them to reflect on their own behavior. They notice that your patience isn't weakness. They notice that your calmness isn't submission. They notice that your consistency doesn't bend to their avoidance, and each observation stirs something deeper than irritation. It awakens curiosity, respect, and yes, even longing. Even amidst this testing, small slips occur. Tiny moments of vulnerability escape through the cracks of their defenses, almost imperceptible if you're not paying attention. A sigh, a hesitation, a glance, a tone that lingers longer than usual. These are not accidents, they are cracks in the armor. They are signs that the internal conflict, the fear of intimacy clashing with the desire to connect, is real and unignorable. And every time you notice it, every time you acknowledge it without judgment, it reinforces the message your boundary is silently sending, that connection doesn't require sacrificing self-respect, that love doesn't demand bending beyond comfort, and that you will not allow disregard to pass unnoticed. During this stage, the avoidant starts creating internal narratives to make sense of the disruption. They replay interactions in their mind. They analyze the words you used, the tone, the firmness, the absence of compromise. They ask themselves questions they never asked before. Did I take this for granted? Did I overlook their needs? Did I assume they would always tolerate my avoidance? Each question is a crack forming in the wall they've spent years building. And though they cannot articulate it yet, they feel an uncomfortable shift. Your boundary is teaching them something they weren't ready to learn, and yet desperately need to understand. Simultaneously, fear grows. Fear that your strength, your self-respect, your unwavering boundary will lead you to walk away. Fear that this moment, this shift, may expose the truth they've long denied to themselves, that closeness is something they can lose if they do not confront their own patterns. But unlike before, this fear does not trigger flight immediately. Instead, it triggers reflection, introspection, the first flickers of true emotional processing. The avoidant begins to see the consequences of avoidance in a way that is tangible, personal, and deeply uncomfortable. They begin to recognize that avoidance no longer shields them, it isolates them. And it is in this discomfort that the emotional revelation begins. They realize, with a mixture of awe and terror, that your boundary is not punishment, but a mirror. It reflects back the areas where they have hidden, denied, or protected themselves at the expense of intimacy. For the first time, they are forced to confront the tension between their fear of vulnerability and their desire to maintain the connection. And this confrontation is not easy. It is messy, confusing, and emotionally taxing, yet it is necessary. Because boundaries do not just reveal who you are, they reveal who the other person is too, in all their unfinished, complicated, and human glory. At this stage, they may still oscillate between pulling away and testing proximity. They may revert to familiar avoidance patterns, silence, distance, or emotional coldness. But each of these behaviors is now accompanied by self-questioning, regret, or unspoken longing. Their actions no longer occur in a vacuum. Instead, they carry the weight of awareness, the burden of realization, the subtle acknowledgement that the dynamic has shifted. And within this tension, the seeds of change begin to take root. Even before they attempt to reconnect, before they reach out or soften, the internal shift is profound. They begin to feel an unfamiliar sensation, respect, not just for you but for the boundaries themselves. They recognize that these boundaries are not walls to keep them out, but structures that define safety, clarity, and balance in the relationship. And though they cannot name it yet, a sense of admiration begins to grow. Admiration tinged with fear, yes, but undeniable nonetheless. And as these internal reflections accumulate, they may start to approach subtle attempts at reconnection, a message, a tone of concern, a lingering question. But these are cautious, tentative, and often almost imperceptible. They are the gestures of someone testing the waters of vulnerability without exposing themselves fully. They are small, fragile, and easily misread, yet they are profoundly telling. They signify the internal transformation that your boundary has triggered, the beginning of recognition that closeness, honesty, and consistency can exist without compromising themselves or you. At this stage, patience is critical. The avoidance internal landscape is a storm of conflicting emotions, fear, longing, confusion, and tentative hope. Your continued consistency, your calmness, and your unwavering respect for your own needs serve as an anchor in this storm. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, they start to soften. They start to question their avoidance patterns. They begin to imagine the possibility that they can show up differently, not because they are forced, but because they want to preserve the bond that matters. The next few days or weeks may feel tense, uncertain, or unpredictable. They may test boundaries again, pull away unexpectedly, or retreat into silence. But these behaviors now carry a different energy. They are no longer purely defensive, they are exploratory. They are the internal negotiation of someone grappling with newfound self-awareness, someone beginning to understand the gravity of emotional connection, someone realizing that their old patterns no longer serve the relationship they want to keep. Even in their testing, you will notice subtle signs of respect. The tone softens, responses become slightly more thoughtful, they linger in conversation longer, they hesitate before dismissing your needs. And each of these small changes is a reflection of the enormous internal struggle they are navigating silently, the collision of fear and desire, avoidance and connection, ego and vulnerability. And here lies the most crucial point. While your boundary may have initially triggered fear, withdrawal, or even confusion, it also set the stage for transformation. Boundaries, when held with clarity and consistency, illuminate the emotional realities that avoidance alone cannot mask. They force the avoidant to confront their own patterns without being attacked, judged, or pressured. And in that confrontation, there is opportunity for awareness, for reflection, for growth, and for the first steps toward authentic intimacy. As the days pass, the avoidant starts noticing something they never expected. Your calmness, your consistency, and your unwavering respect for yourself doesn't push them away. It unsettles them, yes, but it also draws them in. They start questioning why they feel that pull despite their fear, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, curiosity takes root. They begin to think about what it would mean to truly show up for someone without retreating, without hiding, without building walls at every sign of closeness. It's terrifying, because it contradicts everything they have ever known about intimacy, yet it feels strangely magnetic, like a force they cannot resist. They begin to reflect quietly on the past, on moments when they retreated, when they kept distance, when they prioritized avoidance over connection. For the first time, they see the consequences, not just for you, but for themselves. They feel the weight of what they've missed out on, the missed opportunities for closeness, the emotional depth they have denied themselves, and the one person who mattered. And with this realization comes a subtle, almost hidden ache, a longing they are hesitant to admit even to themselves. It is uncomfortable, unsettling, yet deeply stirring. This reflection leads to the first tentative gestures. Maybe they send a text that is slightly warmer than usual, or linger in a conversation longer than before, or ask a question that shows genuine interest in your life. These small actions carry enormous significance. They are not grand declarations of change, nor are they admissions of vulnerability. But they are cracks in the armor, tiny openings that reveal the stirrings of awareness, the first glimpses of emotional risk-taking. Behind every careful word, every subtle gesture, there is a storm of internal reckoning. They are silently negotiating with themselves. Can I trust this connection? Can I allow myself to be seen? Can I risk closeness without running? And then comes the moment when their vulnerability starts to leak in more clearly. It might be in a hesitation before answering, a subtle confession, a story they would normally never share, or a fleeting expression of doubt or fear. It is not dramatic or over the top, but it is profoundly real. In these moments, you see glimpses of the person beneath the avoidance, glimpses of the emotional depth they guard so fiercely. And these glimpses are powerful because they are fragile, delicate, and fleeting. They are not offered to everyone, only to those who have forced the walls to shift without breaking them. The internal tug-of-war continues. On one hand, fear tells them to pull back, to retreat to familiar patterns, to protect themselves from being overwhelmed by closeness. On the other hand, the pull of connection, the recognition of what they might lose if they do not engage authentically, grows stronger with each passing day. Your boundaries, your calm presence, your unwavering respect serve as both a mirror and a guide. They show the avoidant what a healthy dynamic could feel like, clear, consistent, and emotionally safe. And this vision, even if barely conscious, begins to outweigh the instinct to withdraw. Finally, there comes the first subtle attempt at reconnection that carries weight beyond words. A message sent not out of obligation, not out of habit, but out of recognition that something within them needs to bridge the distance they themselves created. A question that invites dialogue, a reflection that acknowledges your presence, a simple acknowledgement of your boundary that says without saying, I see it, I feel it, I want to navigate this with you. It is not a grand gesture, but it is transformative. For the avoidant, this is both terrifying and liberating. For you, it is a moment of clarity. The boundary has not pushed them away. It has revealed the possibility of authentic engagement, the chance to move past fear and into presence. In these moments, the avoidant experiences a subtle but profound internal shift. They start to feel respect for the boundaries themselves, not as obstacles, but as structures that create safety, clarity, and predictability. They begin to see that honoring your limits is not rejection, but a blueprint for connection. It teaches them that closeness does not require sacrificing their autonomy, nor does it require the suppression of their feelings. They start to grasp in an emotional and intuitive way that real connection is possible when boundaries exist, not despite them. And yet, even as they begin to soften, fear is never fully absent. Every gesture of vulnerability carries risk. Every step toward authentic connection is tempered by the memory of past discomforts, the instinctive pull to self-protect, and the internalized belief that closeness inevitably leads to pain. But here's the crucial difference. Your boundary, held with clarity and consistency, has created a container where this exploration is possible. You are no longer reacting to their avoidance with desperation, guilt, or frustration. You are responding with calmness, with consistency, with patience, and this creates the space for them to engage without feeling trapped, manipulated, or overwhelmed. At this stage, the dynamic begins to subtly transform. Their gestures of connection, though small, are deliberate. Their moments of reflection deepen. Their internal dialogue shifts from, how can I protect myself from this, to how can I meet this moment without losing myself. This is a monumental change, though it is often invisible to the casual observer. The avoidant is learning, internally, the paradoxical truth that showing up, allowing themselves to be seen, and honoring someone else's boundaries does not weaken them, it strengthens them, and every tiny, hesitant step they take toward this understanding is a victory, both for them and for the relationship as a whole. And then, almost imperceptibly, admiration begins to intertwine with fear. They admire your strength, your consistency, your clarity, your unwillingness to compromise your self-worth for their comfort. Yet fear persists, fear that if they misstep, if they reveal too much, if they stumble in their attempts, the connection could be lost. And it is this mixture of fear and admiration, tension and longing, that creates the emotional friction where transformation begins to happen. They are forced to confront the parts of themselves that avoidance has protected, to wrestle with vulnerability in ways they never anticipated, and to reckon with the possibility of intimacy without losing themselves. The next few interactions are crucial. Every small attempt to communicate, every careful step toward honesty, is laden with unspoken meaning. Your responses, measured, consistent, and emotionally grounded, reinforce the safety and structure that make these steps possible. And as these moments accumulate, the avoidant begins to feel something extraordinary. The recognition that boundaries are not walls to keep them out, but guides that create the space in which genuine connection can flourish. This stage is both delicate and profound. It is where the avoidant starts to move from internal panic to cautious engagement, from reflection to tentative action, from avoidance to curiosity. Your boundary, once perceived as a challenge or threat, now becomes a mirror, a teacher, a subtle guide showing them the path toward authentic interaction. And while they may still oscillate, still retreat momentarily, the internal transformation is underway. They are beginning to see that connection does not require surrendering, that vulnerability does not equate to weakness, and that honoring someone else's needs can coexist with honoring their own. And so the avoidant starts to step closer, just enough to test the waters. A message, a comment, a question, a slight gesture of attention, each of these is a significant milestone. Though it may seem small, it is the first tangible sign that the internal processing is translating into external action, that the walls are softening, that the emotional distance is beginning to shrink. And with each of these steps they experience the paradoxical relief of realizing that closeness, when approached with care and respect, is not unbearable, it is enriching. And then it happens. There comes a moment so subtle, yet so profound, that it can change the course of everything. The avoidant allows themselves, just briefly, to be seen. It may be a small confession, a hesitation in their words, a story about fear or doubt they've never shared. It may be a message that carries more emotion than they thought they could express, or a pause that lingers with meaning. This moment is fragile, it is delicate, it is terrifying for them and exhilarating for you, because it is the first time they are not hiding behind walls, not retreating behind silence, not avoiding the emotional truth that your boundary has revealed. They are showing you something that has been locked away for a long time, a piece of their inner self they have rarely, if ever, shared. This glimpse of vulnerability is a turning point. For someone who has always avoided closeness, allowing this much exposure is monumental. They feel the tension of fear and relief simultaneously. Fear that showing too much will push you away. Relief that they are not being judged, that you remain calm, consistent, and steady. And in this tension, the avoidant begins to feel something they cannot easily name: connection, intimacy, and perhaps even trust. It is raw, it is real, and it is transformative. At the same time, a profound internal realization emerges. The fear of losing you now outweighs the fear of intimacy. The walls that once felt necessary for survival begin to soften because the stakes feel higher than avoidance itself. They see that retreating does not guarantee safety, staying away does not preserve the bond, and suddenly, the patterns that kept them distant, isolated, and emotionally safe now feel constrictive. Your boundary has done something they did not expect. It has created space for reflection, accountability, and the possibility of emotional growth. This is where the first conscious steps toward change begin. They may not be grand or obvious, they may be small gestures, a message of consideration, a tone of care, a question that seeks understanding. They may hesitate, they may falter, they may second-guess themselves, but the intent is there. Beneath the surface of avoidance, a subtle transformation is taking place. They are beginning to navigate closeness without panicking, to explore vulnerability without fleeing, to recognize that engagement does not equal surrender. They are learning, in real time, that emotional presence can coexist with self-protection. And the beauty of this moment is that it is entirely internal. You may not even notice it at first, but it is profound. They are processing the emotional consequences of your boundary. They are understanding, slowly but surely, that your strength is not a threat, that your consistency is not criticism, that your self-respect is not rejection. They are realizing that to maintain connection, they must meet you in a space that balances honesty, effort, and emotional courage. And this internal negotiation, invisible though it may be, is the true beginning of change. Soon you will notice subtle shifts. They may linger longer in conversation, they may show more attentiveness, they may take small risks to express emotion, curiosity or concern. These actions, while seemingly small, are monumental because they reflect an internal recalibration. The avoidant is learning that intimacy is not something to escape from, but something to navigate with care. They are beginning to understand that boundaries are not walls, but guides that create safety and clarity. And with this understanding, a new dynamic begins to emerge, one rooted in mutual respect, cautious trust, and the possibility of authentic connection. The internal journey does not end here. They continue to oscillate between old habits and new awareness, between instinctual retreat and deliberate engagement. Fear remains, but it is tempered by admiration, curiosity, and the recognition of what is at stake. They replay your words, your firmness, your calmness, and begin to internalize a new paradigm that relationships can be equitable, respectful, and emotionally safe without sacrificing personal integrity. Your boundary has shifted the narrative entirely, forcing them to confront avoidance, not as a permanent shield, but as a choice that can be unlearned with intention. And slowly, over time, respect begins to emerge, not just for you, but for the boundaries themselves. They realize that boundaries are not restrictions, but structures that define safety, consistency, and mutual care. They begin to appreciate your clarity, your calmness, and your courage to stand firm without aggression or manipulation. They start to understand that this balance, rare as it is, creates an environment where intimacy can thrive without fear. And this recognition sparks a subtle transformation, a willingness to engage, to show up, and to experiment with vulnerability. It is in this stage that small acts of connection carry enormous weight. A thoughtful message, a shared reflection, a question asked with genuine curiosity. All of these are gestures of emotional courage. They are the fruit of internal processing, reflection, and self-awareness. They are evidence that the avoidant is beginning to reconcile fear and longing, avoidance and attachment, self-preservation and connection. And each moment, each gesture, each step forward carries the potential for deeper intimacy, trust and authenticity. At the core, what is unfolding is the internal realization that boundaries do not push love away, they invite it in. They reveal truths that avoidance alone cannot mask. They challenge old patterns without shaming, expose hidden emotions without pressuring, and create space for engagement without demand. Your boundary, held firmly and calmly, has done what words alone cannot. It has taught the avoidant that closeness can exist without fear, that connection can coexist with self-respect, and that intimacy is a choice that can be approached with awareness and courage. Finally, this journey leads to the moment where they begin to accept your boundaries fully. Not reluctantly, not as a concession, but as a recognition that they create a healthier, more authentic dynamic. They start to show up more consistently, with small deliberate gestures that indicate awareness, care and the willingness to navigate emotional depth. They no longer see your boundary as a threat, they see it as a foundation for trust, respect and real connection. And in doing so, they step closer to the kind of intimacy they have always feared yet secretly longed for. And in this delicate, beautiful balance where fear, respect, longing and courage intersect, the relationship transforms. They are not perfect, and they may still stumble. Fear may arise, hesitation may linger, and old habits may appear. But the internal shift has occurred. They now have a blueprint for engaging with closeness, for navigating vulnerability, and for honoring boundaries without fleeing. They are learning that intimacy is not annihilation, that showing up does not equal weakness, and that connection, when approached with care and self-awareness, can be safe, enriching, and profoundly rewarding. And so the avoidant who once recoiled at boundaries, who once panicked at firmness, who once pulled away at the hint of self-respect, begins a new chapter. A chapter defined not by fear, not by avoidance, but by the cautious, transformative possibility of genuine emotional connection. All because you held firm, stayed consistent, and honored yourself. All because boundaries, far from pushing love away, created a space where it could finally be recognized, felt, and reciprocated.